This is How to Interpret a DNA Cluster Chart. I'm Nicole Dyer. This tip is sponsored by Family Locket. To learn more, go to familylocket.com/rootstech. So you have a genetic affairs autocluster chart. What does it mean? Maybe you generated a cluster chart from MyHeritage matches. Either way, they all look about this way. There are names along the sides that are DNA matches. Those same names are repeated along the top, and the intersection of the same person is the diagonal line down the middle. That's where a match intersects with themselves. Then when another tester intersects with a different tester, that means they also match you and each other. And then all of these people who match each other are grouped into a cluster where you match most of the other cluster members. The clusters indicate shared ancestry among those in the group. Everyone in the cluster will likely be on the same ancestral line, although the exact most recent common ancestor may vary. The gray boxes outside the colored clusters indicate a person who belongs in both clusters, and it can show a connection between the clusters. In this example, the common ancestors of Cluster 1 were Alice Elmira Robinson and her husband George Franklin Richards. Also, Alice's parents, Lucy Maria Miller and Oliver Lee Robinson. So you can see that all of those people within that cluster probably descended from those two ancestral couples. The common ancestors of Cluster 6 were Franklin D. Richards and his parents, Wealthy Dewey and Phineas Howe Richards. The gray squares in between Cluster 1 and Cluster 6 show a connection between those two clusters. And the reason there is a connection is because Alice Elmira Robinson married George Franklin Richards. And George Franklin Richards' parents were the common ancestors in Cluster 6. Looking at the family tree, you can see how the clusters indicate different lines. Cluster 1 is the Robinson line, and Cluster 6 is the Richards line. Now we'll analyze a network graph created by ConnectedDNA.com. The nodes are DNA matches, and the lines indicate shared match connections between those two matches. Typically, the clusters indicate a common ancestor between all the matches. There are connections between the clusters, meaning they're probably a common ancestor on that same line of the family. When you have a very large cluster, that means that many descendants of that common ancestor have tested. In this particular graph, the larger nodes mean that they are DNA matches who share more DNA with me. Here's an example of a network graph for our Dyer side of the family. I had my father-in-law test, and we found that descendants in cluster 12 were all from the common ancestor of John Robert Dyer and Bathsheba Tharp. Also, we found descendants of Bathsheba Tharp's parents in cluster 12. We had a brick wall on John Robert Dyer, and oral family tradition said that Sarah Taylor was his mother. So as I looked at cluster 3, which was closely connected to cluster 12, I found that the common ancestors of cluster 3 were Moses Taylor and Elizabeth Pravat. Also Owen Doherty and Mary Taylor. So the Taylor surname being very common in this group led me to believe that this was probably the group of people where Sarah Taylor came from. To learn more about analyzing cluster and network graphs, join us in our Research Like a Pro with DNA online course. We also have a book that's brand new with the same name. RootsTech attendees receive a discount on the course. Go to familylocket.com/rootstech to learn more about our free podcast and cheat sheets and other materials, including our books.